Hi, I'm Karen Tate, and I'd like to invite you to a new series called Goddess Calling, and it's based on one of my newest books, Goddess Calling, Sacred Feminine, Liberation Theology. It's full of messages and meditations. And if you don't already know me, I have a few other books out as well. I'm the host of Voices of the Sacred Feminine Radio on Blog Talk for the last 10 years. And this is a result of that. I've edited this great anthology called Voices of the Sacred Feminine. It has everyone in it, from Noam Chomsky to Starhawk to Riane Eisler, Father Roy Bourgeois, Matthew Fox. It's really incredible when you start to see how big the Sacred Feminine umbrella is and all the many voices that are in it. We have so much in common with so many people we might not have realized. I'm also the author of Walking an Ancient Path, Rebirthing Goddess on Planet Earth. My first book, Sacred Places of Goddess, 108 Destinations. I've contributed to a lot of anthologies like this one, Heart of a Woman in Business. And I'm also in the documentary Femme, Women Healing the World. I wish you'd take a look at that. It was produced by Sharon Stone, the actress, and a wonderful fellow by the name of Emmanuel Atier of Wonderland Entertainment. But Goddess Calling is what we're going to focus on in this series. And with each of the episodes, I'd like to read one of the messages or one of the meditations. And to start off the series, because Thanksgiving was just a few days away, I'd like to share with you the story or the message called Separating Truth from Myth. Once you realize how the feminine face of God was swept beneath the sands of time, you begin to realize what passes for truth, history, and myth is written by the conquerors or those in power, often for their own agenda. Many examples come to mind. What we know about Cleopatra comes mostly from her enemies. Can we truly have an accurate picture of this powerful and resourceful woman? And what about all the women whose accomplishments never make the history books? We're constantly reminded of that when we see the dearth of women's history during Women's History Month. Goddess advocates do not believe the myth of the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet actually conveys her true essence and story either. They theorize the myth of this goddess, being a mercenary for her father, the sun god Ra, is clouded in a patriarchal purpose, perhaps as a story to fear women or for women to fear their own power. Mary Magdalene was thought to be a prostitute for centuries, and that story was rather quietly corrected only a few decades ago. The goddess Athena, in patriarchal times, is birthed not from her mother Metis, but from the head of Zeus. We can see how even natural laws are turned on their head when those with the leisure, the authority, or the power are writing the story. And these stories have important consequences in society. Think about how the church silenced science and jailed men who would tell us the earth revolves around the sun, or how the new Christian beliefs taking hold in the world diminished women and led us to the Dark Ages. It wasn't only women who were victimized. What about the destruction of cultures of the Hawaiians, Native Americans, and Aztecs, to name a few, closer to home on our continent? In America, we have our own versions of history. No doubt some Americans turn a blind eye to our country's influence abroad or see that influence one way, while the countries feeling the might of our heavy hand would tell a different story. In my short lifetime, many still question the truth behind the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Whether anyone in our government had advanced knowledge of the bombing of Pearl Harbor or our government's collusion in the fall of the Twin Towers on September 11th, we'll probably never know. When you realize how history can be fluid and truth slip beneath our fingers like drops of water, then we have an obligation to try to separate truth from myth. How many people still believe Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11? How many deny the science of global warming? What about those responsible for writings, children's history books in Texas, wanting to omit the writing of Thomas Jefferson and liberal or African American people because conservatives prefer to have those contributions and ideas hidden from developing minds? Likewise, the George W. Bush Library in Texas is busy today going about distorting the facts about the Iraq War. Will enough people remember the facts of the last decade, or will truth be lost over time yet again? What's missing from the history books? Truth and myth seem to always be in flux, thanks to those with the time and money to rewrite history to their advantage, like those patriarchs who would give men the life-giving capabilities possessed only by women, or Abrahamic religions that would do away with those heathens revering goddess. Remember the destruction of the library in Alexandria? So too did the real history of the indigenous people of America become romanticized and lost as Puritan imperialism set out to conquer the Indians and grab their land. As we sit down each Thanksgiving to give thanks for our bounty, it would probably be important to recognize that those sentiments of gratitude did not originate with the Pilgrims. Instead, they had long been part of the paradigm of the indigenous people who relied so heavily on Mother Earth for their sustenance long before the Puritans arrived on the continent. In fact, it was the generosity, hospitality, and gift-giving of the Indians that kept the Pilgrims alive, and when they arrived in America ill-equipped to sustain themselves, it was the Indians who helped them through. So while Thanksgiving has become an important symbol of cooperation among people, Americans must face that peace between the Pilgrims and Indians was short-lived. In fact, the purpose of the gathering on that first Thanksgiving was to negotiate a treaty that would secure the lands of the Plymouth Plantation for the Pilgrims, and possibly out of a sense of charity toward their hosts, it was the Indians who brought the majority of the food. They say it was 5 deer, wild turkey, fish, beans, squash, corn, soup, cornbread, berries. Indian women and men sat together to eat with the Pilgrim men, while Pilgrim women stood quietly behind the feasting table, awaiting their men to finish their meal before they might partake of the feast. It might be stunning to realize who the Pilgrims actually were. Political revolutionaries who intended to overthrow the government of England, who came to the New World to establish the kingdom of God as foretold in the book of Revelation. When they realized they could not impose their rule of saints' strict Puritan orthodoxy on the British people, they came to America over time in hundreds of ships with the intent to build their holy kingdom. They saw themselves as the chosen elect and used any means, including deception, treachery, torture, slavery, war, and genocide, to achieve their goals. These people were not the stuff of Hollywood's Pilgrims or mythology's noble civilization versus the savage. They were rigid fundamentalists, and anyone who wasn't with them was against them. Consider that Thanksgiving sermon delivered at Plymouth in 1623 by Mather the Elder, who gave thanks for the smallpox plague, which wiped out the majority of the Wampanoag Indians who had been their teachers and benefactors. Mather thanked God for destroying the children and young men which he considered the seeds of increase, thus clearing the forest to make way for better growth. In other words, the Pilgrims. The very people who had been their salvation, feeding them and teaching the Pilgrims the agricultural ways of the region so they might survive, were in actuality exploited and viewed as instruments of the devil. In time, the Pilgrims displayed the same intolerance toward the Indians and their religion that they displayed toward the less popular religions in Europe. Relationships deteriorated, trust was lost. It was the beginning of the end for the generous indigenous people who welcomed the Pilgrims with open arms. Within 50 years, the Wampanoag tribe, so instrumental in helping the pilgrims get a foothold, were extinct. It might be interesting to note that about 150 years later, Benjamin Franklin invited one of the indigenous tribes of the region, the Iroquois, to Albany, New York, to explain their democratic system of government to the country's forefathers. The forefathers were so impressed by what the Iroquois taught them, they developed the Albany Plan of Union, a document which served as a model for the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution of the United States. Notable, too, among the Iroquois, women held the deciding vote in many important matters, and both genders enforced the laws of the village and helped solve problems together. Yet, how many Americans know this version of history? Most of the Native Americans probably do. They know better than most non-Native Americans the history of the Trail of Tears and the devastation brought upon their culture by Christians-run Native American boarding schools. So let us be very careful when we think we know our ancestors and our history, and even what's happening in our present. Let us not be captivated by propaganda, romanticism, or the movie making of Hollywood, or particularly the patriarchal conquerors who would rewrite history for the sake of their legacies as they whitewash their misdeeds, greed, and exploitation. Let us forever be vigilant to seek out the untold story, lest we celebrate falsehoods and sanitized versions of history across the globe. Well, if you've enjoyed that message from God is Calling, stay tuned, there'll be more. Thank you very much, and if you'd like to know more about my work, my website is KarenTate.com.